I'll never forget that night. I had left work late, exhausted after a long, grueling day. By the time I got on the road, it was already past midnight, and I had a couple more hours of driving ahead of me on a rural, dark highway. There was no one else around, no gas stations, no rest stops, just miles and miles of empty road bordered by dark, dense trees. I was tired, but knew I had to keep going. As I drove, I saw something up ahead, a figure on the side of the road. I sat up, squinting, thinking maybe it was an animal or a cyclist in trouble. But as I got closer, I saw it was a woman. She was standing by herself, and something about her was off. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair hung over her face in a disheveled mess, and she stood perfectly still in the darkness. For a moment I felt a strange unease. Against my better judgment, I slowed down, wondering if she might need help. Part of me wanted to keep driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she was in trouble. I pulled over a few meters away and rolled down my window, ready to offer some assistance. "Are you all right?" I called out, trying to sound calm. The woman didn't move right away, but slowly she lifted her head. When our eyes met, a chill ran down my spine. Her face was unnaturally pale, and her mouth twisted into an eerie, stretched smile. It wasn't a smile of relief or gratitude. It was more like a grimace, unnatural and unnerving. Her eyes were wide and dark, as though she were looking straight through me. She mumbled something, but her words didn't make any sense. They were more like growls and distorted whispers, almost like she was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, or like she was trying to speak but didn't know how. A surge of dread washed over me, and my instinct to leave kicked in hard. I hit the gas, speeding away, glancing quickly in my mirror, trying to reassure myself that I'd left her far behind. But the fear inside me only grew when I saw her running after my car. She was moving in jerky, unnatural strides, but somehow keeping up. It was impossible. No one could run that fast, especially someone with her thin, fragile build. I pressed harder on the gas, my heart racing, forcing myself to focus on the road. I told myself not to look back, but I couldn't resist. When I glanced in the mirror, she was still there, far behind, but still visible, with that haunting grin on her face, as if she were enjoying the chase. For miles, I kept pushing the car faster, determined not to look back again. Eventually, when I finally glanced at the mirror, she was gone. The road was empty again, but I didn't feel any relief. The darkness around me felt heavier, and the silence seemed louder. I started questioning if I had imagined the whole thing, or if the exhaustion had somehow warped my mind. When I finally reached my destination, I parked outside my house and sat in the car for a moment, trying to shake off the fear and absurdity of it all. I felt silly for having been so scared over something that had probably been just a strange coincidence. I got out and walked to the trunk to grab my bags. But as I turned, my eyes froze on the back window. There, written in the dust on the rear window, were the words, scrawled in shaky letters, "I'll find you again." I staggered back, staring at the message. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but terror gripped me. How could anyone have written that? I'd been driving at top speed. There was no way someone could have touched my car. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that unnaturally wide smile, those hollow, dark eyes staring at me. Days passed, and though I tried to convince myself it had been some bizarre prank, I couldn't escape the feeling that the woman I'd seen was no ordinary person. Since that night, I avoid any deserted highway after dark. No matter how far out of my way I have to go, I'd rather take a different route than risk seeing her again, waiting by the roadside, her face hidden in the dark. Deep down, though, I know one thing. She meant what she wrote. One day she really will find me again. It was a late night, and I was finally heading home after a long, exhausting shift. The road was almost empty, just an endless stretch of rural highway under a dim, pale moonlight. I was tired, my mind drifting as I drove, looking forward to nothing more than the comfort of my bed. Out of nowhere, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then something strange caught my eye. The car didn't have its lights on. I could only make out its outline because of my own headlights reflecting off its surface. It was an eerie, almost shadow-like vehicle. Something about it felt wrong. As I continued down the highway, I noticed the car was getting closer, way too close. It was practically hugging my bumper now. Nervous, I decided to speed up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car behind matched my speed effortlessly. No matter how fast I went, it stayed right there, glued to my rear bumper. My heart started to pound as my headlights caught sight of a gas station up ahead. It was old and looked out of place, but I felt a surge of relief. Anything to get away from this mysterious tailgater. I pulled into the station, parked, and hurried out of the car, my hands shaking as I looked down the road. But there was nothing. The car was gone. The road was empty, as if it had never been there at all. I walked into the gas station, my nerves on edge, and saw a man behind the counter. He had a tired look, his gray hair untidy, but he seemed alert the moment he saw me. I asked him if he'd seen a car pass by, a dark car with no lights. The man's expression turned grim, almost fearful. He paused before murmuring, "The black car with no lights? People who see that car, they don't come back." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, hoping it was just some strange local legend, but the man's eyes held a look that told me he was serious. The fear lingered, even as I got back in my car and drove home. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark, shadow-like car right behind me. Now every time I drive down a lonely road at night, I can't help but glance into my rearview, hoping, no, praying, that I won't see those headlights ever again. It was one of those freezing winter nights where the world seems to stand still. I had spent the whole day in a work meeting in a city several hours away from home, and night had already taken over the road when I finally started my way back. I chose a shortcut that passed through a dense, solitary forest. There was barely any traffic, and the winding road was shrouded in such thick fog that I could hardly see more than a few meters ahead of me. I turned on the high beams, but they barely made a difference in the opaque fog curtain. I drove for miles in that unsettling silence, accompanied only by the sound of the engine and the occasional crunch of dry branches under my tires. The phone signal had disappeared long ago, and in that solitude, time seemed to stretch. At one point, I realized I had begun to feel an unease I couldn't explain. It was as if something invisible was watching me from the dark web of trees along the side of the road. After an hour, the silence was abruptly broken by the sound of my phone. I jumped, knowing that there shouldn't be any signal in the middle of this forest, and that the last message I had received was when I was still near the city. I looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. Although I usually never answer unknown numbers, something inside me, maybe the same curiosity that's always been part of me, led me to pick up. The air in the car grew even heavier when I heard the voice on the other end. It was a voice I instantly recognized because, although it seemed impossible, it was my own. A chill ran down my spine as that voice, identical to mine, urgently described the road I was on. "You're in danger," the voice said. "You need to get out of there." I froze, unable to react. The voice not only sounded like mine, but it spoke with a mix of desperation and warning that filled me with a terror I had never felt before. As I heard my voice describe the road, the forest, and the exact curves I had just passed, my mind filled with questions. How could someone or something know exactly where I was and what I was seeing? I tried to calm myself, thinking it must be some kind of prank or mistake. But the voice interrupted my thoughts with a plea. "Don't turn around." Those words, spoken in my own tone and with an urgency I couldn't ignore, filled me with panic. An irrational, deep fear began to take over me. My skin crawled, and a part of me wanted to obey, but another part, that insatiable curiosity, pushed me to look. Unable to resist any longer, I looked in the rearview mirror, and there, in the back seat, I saw something that made me gasp in terror. There was a figure, a dark, shapeless shadow, with a distorted appearance as if its body was made of smoke or something ethereal. The figure had no face, but I felt its gaze fixed on me. I was paralyzed, unable to move or look away. I was trapped in that moment, in that terrifying instant where every fiber of my being told me to run, but my body remained still. Finally, in a reflexive act, I turned forward and accelerated the car. Driven by a terror I had only known in the deepest nightmares, I sped up without looking back, feeling the air around me grow heavier, almost as if something was trying to push me back toward the figure I had seen. The voice on the phone kept speaking, repeating my name, each time with a more distant and distorted tone, until it finally cut off and silence filled the car again. I drove without stopping until I finally saw the lights of a small town. I stopped at the first gas station I found, got out of the car, and sat on the ground, breathing heavily. My hands trembled, and every sound, no matter how small, made me jump. An elderly man, the owner of the gas station, approached and asked if I was okay. I tried to explain what had happened, but seeing his skeptical expression, I realized it didn't make sense. Who would believe a story like that? As the old man returned to his store, I realized I had left my phone on the seat of the car. I picked it up and checked the recent calls. There was no record of the call, as if it had never happened. Only the silence of that cold night and the shadow in the back seat were proof that something strange had occurred. Since that night, I've never driven through that forest at night again. And every time I see an unknown number on my phone, a part of me remembers that voice, that warning, and the indescribable terror of encountering something I shouldn't have seen.